Hello and welcome back to the European Compliance and Ethics Conference. If you've been with us since the morning, then I hope you've enjoyed the networking tables. They were really full, and there'll be more opportunity to network with other leading experts in the compliance field, both in the lunch break and again in the coffee break. If you've just joined us, then welcome to the first ECEC. My name is Tanya Higgins, and you can see me as the MC for the ECEC. It's my pleasure to guide you through today's program. Now, we've got two more points before the lunch break. First of all, we'll be taking a look at the role of behavioural science in compliance, and that has seen a keen interest already in Dr. Klaus Morsmeyer's keynote speech. And then after that, we'll be hearing from Dan McCrum from the Financial Times all about the story of Wirecard. Now, we're live streaming directly from Munich, Germany. Yes, the scene of the crime, Munich, where Wirecard, the fraud scandal, took place. 2 billion euros missing. How was that even possible? I'd be curious to hear, could perhaps the role of behavioural science prevented what has happened at Wirecard? Now, before our next presenter, I would like to tell you a little bit about the polls section, because Christian Hunt, who will be presenting for the role of behavioural science, has a question for you. Now, if you click on the left-hand side of the screen on the on-air session, then you will find the poll there. It'd be great if you could answer the poll, because he will discuss this in his presentation. The question is, how much do you use behavioural science in your compliance program? So take a look at that. Click on the on-air session on the left of the screen, and then the poll question will come up for you. So now let's take a look at our next speech.
We are very pleased to welcome our next speaker, Christian Hunt, founder of Human Risk. Prior to founding the company, he was managing director and head of behavioral science at UBS, having previously been a global head of compliance at UBS and a senior UK financial services regulator. Christian specializes in bringing behavioral science to ethics and compliance. He's of the opinion that human risk is the largest single risk facing organizations. The best way to mitigate it is by increasing our understanding of how and why people make decisions.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this presentation. As it said, my name is Christian Hunt, you can see there. And I'm going to be talking to you about bringing behavioral science to compliance. Now, my background has just been put in the video, and I've put this slide up here, one, so you can see a Lego version of me that I love sharing with people, but secondly, so that you can just be reminded of the fact that the comments I'm about to make come from the perspective of someone that's been a compliance officer and been a regulator. And I stress that very much because some of the things I'm about to say might seem slightly counterintuitive or rebellious. And the first comment that I'm going to make along those lines is that I hate compliance. I cannot stand it. Now, before you all throw things at your screens, take a look. There's a little asterisk there. And what I've said there is I don't hate compliance as a concept. I don't hate compliance as a mission. I definitely don't hate the people within it. I just hate the brand. I think it sounds terrible. If we were trying to create a brand that sounded officious and dull and obstructive and unpleasant, we would use words like compliance. And if we look at what the word compliance means, it's the action or fact of complying with a wish or command. Now, given that branding, we perhaps shouldn't be surprised that people's reaction to compliance is the one that you can see on the screen now. People very often talk about it as the rules people, or the business prevention unit. There's a real negative vibe towards that piece. And I think the main reason for that is the way we go about doing compliance. Traditional approaches rely on the organization telling people what to do and expecting them to comply with it. And my contention is we shouldn't really be surprised that people react in the way they do, because we failed simply at the branding task. Now, what if we think about compliance, what actually is it? Well, The interesting thing is, of course, if you think about the objective of compliance, getting an organization to do the things it needs to do to be within the rules, then it's very difficult to turn around to an organization and say, you need to be compliant. Inanimate objects don't generally respond to instructions. So the way that we get compliance is by getting to the people that are within the organization. Organizations cannot be compliant of their own accord. It's the employees within that determine what happens. So in simple terms, if we can get the employees within the organization to do what we want them to do, then the organization will by default be compliant. We're actually in the business of influencing human decision making, which is why I say compliance shouldn't be thought of as a theoretical discipline with rules, but we're in the game of influencing human decision making. And if that's the mission of compliance, then I think we really need to think about how we go about doing that. And so what I started to do when I was a regulator and a compliance officer was really think about, if we're in the business of influencing human decision making, then shouldn't we be copying ideas that other people who are in the business of decision making use? And one of the biggest examples of people in the business of decision making are advertisers. They speak to us on a daily, hourly basis, trying to persuade us to buy things, to use services. They're in exactly the same business. And so what I started to realize as I was a compliance officer was that the techniques that advertisers use, the techniques that governments use to persuade us to behave in a certain way, to do things they want us to do, or to not do things they don't, is to use something that advertisers and governments have started to evolve, which is a concept of behavioral science. And behavioral science has many, many definitions. You might have heard of behavioral economics, fairly similar principle. Here is my definition of what behavioral science is. It's about understanding the real drivers of human decision making so we can influence them to deliver better outcomes. Now, notice I've highlighted two words there. The first one is the real drivers. We often have good reasons for doing things, excuses why we do things. That's not necessarily the actual reason that we've done things. We're very good at justifying our decisions, and often we'll take them for reasons that we don't fully understand. So behavioral science is about understanding the real reasons we do things. And I've also put the word better in color there to emphasize it, because all of the techniques that we use for good things, we can also use for bad things. And one of the interesting things is, as you answered that question about whether you were using behavioral science, the answer is you all are. You just might not realize it, and you might not be doing it particularly effectively. But every time we have an interaction with people, every time we're trying to persuade them to do something, whether we're sending them an email or giving them instruction, you are using behavioral science techniques. And of course, one of the most obvious techniques that we can deploy is just telling people what to do. But as we know, that doesn't always work. Here's a great example from London of the government trying to get people to practice social distancing. They've put a sign there. It's telling people what to do, and you can see that people aren't responding to it. And what that tells us is a really good example is that people won't just do what they're told. We need to find other ways of getting to them. Now, sometimes they will, but very often we need to think about alternative techniques. And so one of the things I like to highlight to people is the fact that when we think about compliance, the reason compliance fails sometimes, and very often in fact, is because we misunderstand the audience. We're not thinking about things from the audience's perspective. And you'll notice I've put misunderstand in inverted commas. The reason for that is I think we sometimes deliberately misunderstand them. We make no effort sometimes whatsoever to think about things from the audience's perspective. We think about things from an organizational perspective. We work out the priorities of the organization, and we just assume that the individuals will comply. And as what we've seen from that example with the social distancing sign, that is not necessarily the way that people's brains operate. And so on the page now, I've got something I call the evolution of human motivation. And I just want to take you through this because this illustrates the different ways that we can influence human decision making. And I've called it evolution because actually it tracks the way that we grow up as children. So if you think about things when you're very young, you're in an environment where command is the order of the day. Parents will tell you what to do, and you willingly comply. Now, in that situation, it makes perfect sense. Children don't know what to do. They have no sense of experience of the world, and they really don't know what they're doing. So telling them what to do makes perfect sense. And there are some examples in the kind of compliance arena where telling people what to do is a legitimate strategy. If you're in the nuclear power industry, if you're in the food industry, there are certain things you're going to want people just to do and not to question, simply to follow instructions. So that's one set, orders. As we get older, what we see is parental techniques shift a little bit. And so we see some of the other techniques that are available to parents and to us as adults. And we move into what I call the compliance stage. That's when you have rules and regulations. So you're a little bit older, a little bit more sophisticated. You can cope with the concept of rules. So we set rules and parameters. Then as we get older, they need to bribe us and they need to punish us. So we get given bribery and rewards, depending on whether it's a good behavior or bad behavior, to try and keep us in line. Again, it's a sense of greater responsibility and understanding of the environment. And then we get to a stage that I call the marketing stage, which is really the idea that people are old enough to know better, and all we have to do is tell them what to do. Let's educate them and inform them. And because they're smart and older, they'll understand how to react to that. So that's the marketing approach. You see that very much in health campaigns. And as you go through these techniques, what you can see is an increasing level of sophistication and trust on the part of the organization issuing instructions. So in the example I've given the parents, but also on the part of the target audience. So the closer you are to being sophisticated, intelligent, understanding what's going on, the greater the opportunity to be flexible around our approaches. And then the ultimate piece on the right-hand side is to use behavioral science, is to really think about what's driving human decision-making and to design environments around it. Now, these techniques that we use as we're growing up, that are used on us as we're growing up, can be very effective. And there are times when it makes perfect sense to use them. But very often in a compliance context, we rely on things on the left-hand side of the page rather than the things that are on the right-hand side of the page. What I want to try and encourage you to do in this presentation is to say our toolkit as compliance officers is much bigger than the command, compliance, economics, or marketing tools. We can actually use behavioral science to really get to the drivers of why our target audience is behaving in the way it is. And I want to give you a few examples of things that I think don't think this through properly that come from compliance things that I have been part of or seen operating in firms. The first one is what I call read the policy. Very often we say to people, if you want to find out what to do, read the policy. Now that's very sensible from an organizational perspective, that you'll just put it in a thing and expect people to read it. But if you put something in a 300-page policy, it's pretty unlikely that people are going to want to wade through that. So we've created a structure that's organizationally convenient, a nice big fat policy that covers the organization, but from a user perspective, it's terrible. So if we have to have policies, and I recognize that that's sometimes a good thing, then why don't we think about other ways of communicating with people that doesn't require them to wade through a policy? We know that it's not a fun exercise, so we shouldn't be surprised if our approach is to tell people to do that. Next thing is mandatory training. There's a great temptation in the compliance world to force people through mandatory training. There was one firm that I worked with that actually sent out emails that said invitation to mandatory training. That's really annoying, by the way, because it's either an invitation or it's mandatory. It can't be both. And what we do when we do some of these mandatory training programs, where we put every single person in an organization through training, is we treat them like sheep. We say to everybody, you must do this training. Now, if we are sending people on training that they don't understand, that doesn't feel relevant to them, then what we're doing is basically saying, we don't care what you think. We're forcing you to go through this exercise because it's important for us. So treating people like sheep is not behaviorally smart. What we need to do is think about making sure the audience understands why it's going on the training and questioning whether it's really relevant. Is it really necessary for every single person in the organization to have done this training? And then one of the next things I wanted to highlight was this idea of annual attestations. Lots and lots of organizations say to their employees, you need to attest to us that you have followed all of the rules and that you understand them. Now that's very logical and looks good from a legal perspective. But if we have a think about other times in life when we're required to do something similar, you'll notice a pattern. And the first example I've got on the screen there is from iTunes, but you can pick any app or software. When you download that software, you click on something that says you have read and understood and agreed to all of the terms. But how many people actually do that? We don't, because we can't negotiate with Apple. We can't negotiate with a software provider. We know that we just have to click through. And the annual attestation process is the same thing in many organizations. We just are being asked to say yes to something in order to keep our job. So technically, it passes the test. But from a behavioral perspective, it doesn't actually mean that they say what they've agreed to. It doesn't mean that people have read it. They've just got used to ticking it. So if we do something in the real world, we shouldn't be surprised in a compliance environment if people behave the same way. Other example of this scenario is car hire. If you think about that, it's a horrible experience. You go there, you have to sign your life away. They try and sell you horrible insurance practices. Awful, awful process. You just want to go on vacation. But when you're stood there at the car hire desk, again, you're signing lots of things you probably haven't read. So if we're doing it in the real world, why do we expect people to behave differently in a compliance environment? The answer is they probably won't. So if we start to think about some of these compliance exercises and approaches through a behavioral lens, we can start to understand some of the ways that we might better influence people. And I want to close out by giving you a few real life examples that aren't technically from compliance, but they'll kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about. And the first one is, this is from a London park. And the objective here is to stop people taking their bicycle down this particular path. And what you'll see here is it is theoretically perfect. It's a brilliant solution because you can't get your bicycle down that path. But what do people do? The answer is they find a way around it. And so what you have here is a brilliant illustration in the physical world of a compliance control that is theoretically perfect, but ignores the realities of human behavior. And whether you're thinking about controls or whether you're thinking about communications internally, very often we design things like those barriers on the path. But what happens in reality is people go around it. We haven't thought about the actual underlying behavior. So let's pick a better example. And this comes again from London, where they had an issue with people smoking outside an underground station. Now, smoking is not allowed inside. So what do people do? They naturally smoke outside. Now, one of the solutions that they tried was they put signs up that said, please don't smoke. But what's very interesting is if you put a sign up saying, please do not smoke, what that tells smokers is that actually lots of people smoke there, because you wouldn't put a sign up if it wasn't a big problem. And then what smokers tend to do is they look on the ground, and if they see other people's cigarette butts, that's a really good indication that other people smoke. So what they wanted to try and do was to stop people smoking, and they found a really clever way to do it, which was to say that they recognized they couldn't stop people smoking, but perhaps they could move it away from the entrance. And the way they did that here wasn't to put up a sign to say, you need to not smoke, don't pick up your cigarette butts, but they found a fun way to get people to engage with the process. They turned it into a game. And so people were allowed to vote on their favorite player. As a Bayern Munich fan, I disagree with the setting of the question, but nonetheless will accept the fact that in the UK, maybe this worked. So they asked people to vote who their favorite footballer is. And the lovely thing about this is what it does is it gives you a sense of fun as you put your cigarette butt in. The second thing is the more cigarette butts there are, the more you will see that people are using the system. So you'll copy other people in doing it. Brilliant way of solving the problem of people smoking outside the station in a way that doesn't cause mess and doesn't send a signal to other people that it's acceptable. So this is a good example of a compliance technique that we can use using behavioral science. It's called gamification. Turn something into a game and people are more likely to do it. And then the final example that I want to share with you is, I think, amazing. This is from a school in the US, and they were forced to go back. And the kids were due to come back, and somebody said, we need to put screens between the desks. Now, for children, that is a horrible, horrible experience. So what one teacher did, which I think is incredible, is she turned all of the desks into cars. So every single one of them had their own Jeep that they were sitting in. And by doing that, actually, she's turned compliance into something fun. She's thought behaviorally about her target audience, the children, They are going to panic. They're going to be in a horrible situation if they've got glass on either side. So what do? You take that activity, you take the thing you want them to do, and you turn it into something fun and engaging. Those kids are going to comply without even realizing they have actually made compliance fun. And this is my key message with behavioral science. If we think about the target audience and we understand what is driving the target audience, then we have a better chance of getting people to do what we want. These traditional techniques of just telling people what to do, issuing instructions can work. But actually, if we need people to engage with the process, we need them to do it for a long period of time. We don't like being told what to do. And therefore, thinking about the drivers becomes supremely powerful. So when people ask me, what is compliance? I say we need to look at it as an outcome. It's not a process. Let's focus on what we're trying to get people to do. Think about the underlying drivers and not treat it like we just have to get them to follow through. We're looking for the behavior that we're trying to drive. And if we think about that behavior, we can find smart ways to get people to do what we want. Final slide then is 2 examples of behavioral science. On the left, if you like this presentation and you're interested in subscribing to my newsletter, if you just point your camera at the screen, that will take you to a sign-up page where you can sign up for my newsletter. Good example of behavioral science. I want you to do something, so I've made it really easy for you. And then on the right-hand side is another bit of behavioral science which says, what questions do you have? Now you'll say, what's clever about that? Well, I'm not saying, do you have any questions? I'm saying, what questions do you have? I am telling you that I'm expecting you to have questions, which is a really smart way of encouraging you to ask them. So a little bit of behavioral science on that final slide. I'm hopefully just about in time to allow you to ask those questions that I know you will have.
Perfect timing, Christian. Thank you so much for your very engaging presentation on behavioral science. Now, before we get to the questions, as you've just said, let's have a look at the results of the answers to your poll. And your poll question was, how much do you use behavioral science in your compliance program? Now, I'm really surprised by the first answer, that it got 11%. I don't know. How is that possible?
Well, so I think the answer there is that people don't think that what they're doing uses behavioral science. But the interesting thing about behavioral science is we are deploying its techniques all of the time. Whenever we engage with other people, we're trying to persuade them. So the answer, what that tells you, is that people don't realize that they're doing it. And so many of the techniques that we use in the compliance world feel logical and sensible, but actually they potentially have behavioral implications because we don't think about it from the perspective of the target audience. We presume that because we employ them, we can just tell them what to do, and that will work in some situations, but it won't necessarily work in others. So what this interestingly illustrates is that people don't think they're using behavioral science techniques, but they actually are. So the answer simply is, if you're going to use this stuff, which you will do inadvertently, then it's better to understand what you're doing, the implications, because that'll allow you to find new, innovative ways to get better outcomes.
Well, that leads on to the next answer, which is not at all, 38%, a little, 26%, and somewhat, 14%, and one more, a lot, 9%. So how do you think those weigh out? Is that representative of your experience?
It's not surprising at all. And part of the reason, I discovered behavioral science as I was a compliance officer, struggling with some of these things, going, why are people not doing what I want them to do? And that's when I had that revelation that compliance is the business of influencing human decision-making. And suddenly, if you open up that possibility, there are lots of techniques that are used in other contexts. They're used by advertisers, by governments, that we can deploy in compliance. And there are 2 benefits. Firstly, you will increase the level of compliance. So generally, people will be more compliant if you really target them in the right way. The second thing is you can increase the quality of compliance. Many of the things we need people to do have an element that is qualitative, where we need them to be engaged, where we don't just want them to tick the box. We want them to think about what they're doing. The more engaged you need them to be, the more you need to engage them. And many of traditional compliance techniques don't do that. So I'm delighted to see that there are people using this stuff. But if you want to get better outcomes from a compliance perspective, you need to be thinking behaviorally.
Okay, Kristen, you asked for the questions. You've got loads of them. The most popular question seems to be, for most employees, training is annoying. Do you have any tricks to motivate them? So people want details from you.
Yeah, so look, first thing is decide whether the training is necessary. I remember my assistant when I was working at a bank used to have to do training on things like the Volcker law in the US, stuff that made no sense to her, that wasn't going to be relevant. So the first thing is make sure that people actually need to do it. It's really easy to say, let's get every employee to do training. But actually, if it's dull, if it's not relevant, if it doesn't, what will happen is not only will they not engage with that training, but they won't engage with any of your training because it's that boring stuff that comes from the training team. So try and make it as relevant as possible. Try and make it as engaging as possible. There's a natural temptation to make it fun. That can work. But the key thing is if you've got terrible content that doesn't feel relevant to the target audience, that's boring, doesn't matter how fun you make it, it's still going to have terrible content. So start with the content and work out what do you need them to do? When do you need them to do? And they need to have a sense of why it's important to them personally, not just the organization. So quite a lot you can do. We don't really have time to go into details, but there's a lot of techniques that can be deployed that will make training more effective.
Thanks for that answer, Kristen, because that leads into another very popular question from our viewers, which is, do you have examples of the most efficient communication channels via compliance context, for example, anti-bribery, anti-harassment, and so forth?
So yeah, the trick here, I think, particularly in the current environment where we've got digital channels that perhaps we weren't using as powerfully before, is to think broadly. One of the things that we all know from personal experience is that we get bored of seeing the same stuff. We like a bit of mixing it up. We like things to be a bit different. So my message to people is have a look at who else is communicating with you effectively and how they're doing it. So you might take inspiration from TikTok videos. I don't necessarily mean that you present compliance as a dance, but have a look at TikTok, have a look at Peloton, have a look at all of these companies that are engaging with us. How does Facebook do it? And there is no reason why compliance can't use some of these techniques and these technologies. We tend to think because it's a serious subject that we have to communicate in a serious way. Actually, we don't. We can find new, innovative, exciting ways, and we have to engage people, particularly in this digital world where they've bombarded with stuff. If you're just presenting something really boring through a traditional means, through a flat screen, you're going to lose your audience. So I suggest look at other techniques that are out there. Airline safety briefings is a good example of someone taking a compliance requirement and making it more engaging and interesting so that people pay attention. And it's not just about how you do it, it's about when you do it, it's the way you deliver the message. There's a whole host of things that need to go into it. But you really need to think about things from the target audience perspective. And we often don't do that. We start from the premise of what's easy for the organization to do. And people can smell that. People know when you are just doing something that's dull and simple for you. They'll recognize it, they'll switch off, and you won't get the engagement you want.
For the viewers who asked that question about communication, I'd say hold on for the afternoon session. We'll be looking closely at the best practices for communicating your compliance message with Nicole Pitts. Kristen, back to you. Another question, if I can summarize, is basically humans make the decisions, but companies have their code of conduct, and isn't that code of conduct enough to guide humans in their decisions for basic compliance and ethics behavior?
So codes of conduct, really good idea in principle, but then it comes to the practicalities. And one of the things that's interesting is many codes of conduct say things like, don't be evil. And what we need to do is to think about what do people really need help with? And if your code of conduct is indistinguishable from another company's code of conduct, if it's just dull boilerplate stuff, then people will look at it and go, this isn't relevant, this isn't serious. And it also depends on the training and the engagement from that code of conduct, because very often what we do is we train people in extremities. We talk about black and white situations, financial services, it's someone's turned up with a briefcase full of money, what do you do? That's pretty obviously slightly weird. But we train people on these hypotheticals, on these extremities. People don't need help with the black and white, they need help with the gray. And so the code of conduct is a great idea, can be very useful, but it really needs to speak to the realities of the challenges people are facing. And if all we're doing is giving them some very simple basic guidelines that they could probably work out for themselves, that's not helpful. What we need to do is give people enough of a sense of what they're right and mechanisms by which they can get help when they're confused. because all too often we kind of present the code of conduct and go, there you go, that's what you need to do. The code of conduct in most cases isn't going to give you the specific guidance in a specific situation. So we have to reflect the realities of the world people are in. That is a grey world, not a black and white world. And codes of conduct are often written in very black and white terms. So I like them as an idea, but they need to be behaviourally sound and they need to speak to the realities that are recognised by people that are actually on the ground.
We've got time for one final question from the viewers, and they sound a little bit frustrated because the question is, do you really believe that companies are interested in employees being compliant, or are they just technically playing by the rules?
Look, it's a great question, and there's a lot of cynicism out there. And there are definitely companies out there whose approach to compliance is, we will run our business by reference to what the rules say, and if the rules say we can do it, we'll do it. And if they don't, we won't, and we'll skirt as close as we can to that. I think what we've started to see is lots of examples of companies that have managed themselves by what they can get away with. And in the 21st century, there is greater transparency than ever before. And so I would argue that a business that thinks in those terms is not going to survive because they will get exposed. There's a lot more communication, a lot more visibility on what's going on within companies. People are much more interested in how companies do things as much as what they are doing. And when I say people, I mean employees, I mean regulators, I mean customers. There is a lot more focus on this. So I think historically, absolutely, there are companies out there thinking like that. There are still some that think they can do that today. That is a very short-lived term. People will start to see what's going on. People are becoming much more aware and alive to these issues. You know, COVID has really highlighted ethics as a key topic. We're seeing much more ethical considerations. And you're not an ethical company if you just slavishly follow the rules. And remember, we've seen lots of examples where regulators didn't necessarily have the right rules in place. They will come and pursue firms afterwards, and they'll find reasons to do that. So the idea that just by doing something that's legal, you are 100% future-proofing your organization is really bad. I have a simple phrase. It's just because you can doesn't mean you should. And we need to start thinking in those terms. So I think companies that think of compliance purely as a we have to do this, and they don't think about actually whether they should be doing it, are liable to find themselves in trouble either with regulators or with their employees or their customers at some point in the future.
Christian, thank you so much for your time. I think there would be lots more questions coming from our viewers. Unfortunately, the time is too short to hear everything that you have to say on behavioural science. So I'm sure you can expect more questions from the attendees. Thank you for your time. Look forward to seeing you next year.
Bye.